May 12, 1944, 9:15 in the morning. 886 American bombers lift off from airfields scattered across England, their formations stretching for miles across the overcast sky. 735 fighters rise to escort them. It is the largest single air operation the 8th Air Force has ever attempted. In the briefing rooms hours earlier, veteran crews had groaned when the curtain was pulled back to reveal the day's targets. They were heading for places most of them had never heard of. Luna, Bolin, Zeitz, Brux. These names meant nothing to the young Americans strapping into their B-17s and B-24s. But within months, these names would become synonymous with terror, with death, with the most dangerous missions of the entire air war. These were Germany's synthetic fuel plants. And on this spring morning, the Allies were about to strike at the single most vulnerable point in the entire Nazi war machine. Germany had a problem that shaped its entire military strategy from the moment Adolf Hitler came to power. The nation possessed vast reserves of coal but almost no petroleum. This geographic accident of geology had haunted German planners since the First World War, when the Royal Navy's blockade had strangled the Kaiser's war effort and contributed directly to Germany's defeat. Hitler understood this vulnerability intimately. When he became chancellor in 1933, one of his first priorities was achieving fuel independence through the miracle of chemistry. German scientists had developed two revolutionary methods of transforming coal into liquid fuel. The first was the Bergius process invented by Friedrich Bergius, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1931 for his groundbreaking work. This process subjected crushed coal to extreme conditions, pressures between 200 and 700 atmospheres and temperatures ranging from 400 to 600 degrees Celsius, all in the presence of hydrogen gas. The chemical reaction produced high-octane aviation gasoline. The second method was the Fischer-Tropsch process developed by Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Coal Research in Mulheim. This technique first gasified coal at lower pressures, then converted the resulting synthesis gas into liquid hydrocarbons suitable for diesel engines and motor vehicles. Both processes were expensive and required massive industrial facilities. But they offered Germany something it desperately needed: independence from foreign oil that could be cut off by naval blockade or diplomatic pressure. In December 1933, the chemical conglomerate IG Farben signed its first agreement with the Nazi regime, committing to expand synthetic fuel production at its massive Luna works in exchange for generous government price guarantees. The partnership between German industry and the Nazi state would transform the Reich's energy landscape. By October 1934, Berlin ordered the creation of Brabag, a new company dedicated specifically to distilling synthetic fuels from lignite, the brown coal abundant in central Germany. The four-year plan announced in 1936 accelerated construction further. The Reich was building an entirely new industry from scratch, one that would eventually employ hundreds of thousands of workers and consume billions of Reichsmarks in investment. By early 1944, 25 synthetic fuel plants were operating across Germany and its occupied territories. Together, they produced over 124,000 barrels of fuel per day. 12 of these were Bergius hydrogenation plants, which remained the only domestic source of aviation gasoline for the Luftwaffe. 9 were Fischer-Tropsch facilities producing motor fuel for tanks, trucks, and transport vehicles. The plants clustered predictably near their raw material sources in the Ruhr industrial region, in central Germany around Merseburg and Leipzig, in Upper Silesia near the Polish border, on the Baltic coast near Stettin, and in occupied Czechoslovakia. Their geographic concentration near coal deposits made them identifiable targets. The crown jewel of this synthetic empire was the Luna works near the town of Merseburg in central Germany. Luna was not merely a factory but an industrial city unto itself. The complex stretched 3.5 kilometers long and approximately 1.3 kilometers wide. It contained 250 separate buildings connected by a maze of pipes, electrical conduits, and rail lines. 35,000 workers labored within its boundaries, including approximately 10,000 forced laborers brought from concentration camps across occupied Europe to perform the most dangerous work. Luna alone produced more than 620,000 tons of fuel per year, roughly 11% of Germany's total synthetic output and 1/3 of its nitrogen for explosives manufacturing. But its most critical product was aviation gasoline. Every drop of fuel that kept the Luftwaffe flying came from Bergius hydrogenation plants like Luna. There was no alternative source. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, Germany's air armaments chief and deputy to Hermann Göring, recognized this critical vulnerability a full year before the Allies exploited it. In the summer of 1943, he delivered a stark warning to his colleagues in the German High Command. "The hydrogenation plants are our most vulnerable spots," Milch declared bluntly. "With them stands and falls our entire ability to wage war." His warning could not have been clearer, but it went unheeded. No significant additional defenses were deployed. The plants continued operating at full capacity. The Allied bombers did not come. Germany used the precious time to build more fighters, train more pilots, and stockpile ammunition. All of this preparation would soon prove worthless. The decision to attack Germany's oil production was not inevitable. It emerged from one of the most consequential and contentious strategic debates of the entire air war. Throughout the winter and spring of 1944, three competing visions clashed as Allied commanders prepared for the invasion of France. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder served as General Dwight Eisenhower's Deputy Supreme Commander. He championed what became known as the Transportation Plan. Tedder wanted to concentrate Allied bombers against French and Belgian railway marshalling yards, systematically destroying the rail network that would carry German reinforcements to the Normandy battlefield once the invasion began. His scientific advisor, Professor Sally Zuckerman, had published a detailed planning paper in January 1944 proposing attacks on 72 specific rail targets. Tedder remained deeply skeptical about attacking oil facilities, expressing doubt about the real vulnerability of synthetic plants, where the enemy had presumably taken immense precautions against air attack. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris commanded Royal Air Force Bomber Command, and he opposed both transportation and oil targeting with equal vehemence. Harris preferred continuing his area bombing campaign against German cities, believing firmly that destroying urban industrial centers would break civilian morale and eventually force Germany's unconditional surrender. He dismissed selective targeting of specific industrial systems as panacea thinking, the naive belief that destroying any single target category could win the war by itself. Harris wanted to burn Germany's cities, not pick apart individual factories. Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz commanded all United States strategic air forces in Europe, and he had developed a fundamentally different vision. May 12 had become convinced through careful analysis that Germany's fuel production, 886 American bombers lift off from airfields scattered across England. He presented his plan for completion for miles across the overcast sky, proposing systematic destruction of 14 synthetic fuel plants and 13 petroleum refineries. It is the largest single air operation estimated that attacking these targets could reduce total briefing rooms hours by 50%. Veteran crews and German fuel availability pulled back to reveal the day's below minimum military requirements. They were heading for places most of them had never heard of. An elegant strategic logic that distinguished it from competing proposals. These names meant nothing to the young Americans would certainly defend their oil production to the last fighter plane. But within months, that these names would become synonymous with inevitably force the Luftwaffe into the most dangerous air battles over the target areas. These were Germany's critical pre-invasion objective of air superiority, and on this spring morning, while simultaneously destroying the very fuel needed the single most vulnerable German military in the entire Nazi war machine. It was a strategy designed to accomplish two vital objectives military strategy from the moment Adolf Hitler March 25, 1944, the nation possessed vast reserves of coal, but almost no petroleum. He chose the transportation plan as the primary geology had haunted German planners overruling the First vigorous protests. When the Royal Navy's blockade had strangled the Kaiser's war effort, and he believed attacking rail yards Germany's offered defeat. More certain returns. Hitler understood this vulnerability in true vulnerability when he became chancellor in 1933. But critically for the course one of his first priorities was achieving fuel to attack oil targets whenever his forces were not German scientists had developed two revolutionary methods of transforming coal into liquid fuel. On May 1st, the first was the persuaded Allied commanders Friedrich 15th Air Force, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry in southern Italy, possessed sufficient strength to strike both this transportation and crushed oil targets simultaneously without pressures between 200 and 700 atmospheres and temperatures ranging from Romanian oil fields to 600 degrees Celsius. 11 days later of hydrogen gas. The chemical reaction began in earnest high-octane aviation gasoline. On that fateful spring morning, was the Fischer-Tropsch 326 by Franz Fischer and Hans Fortress bombers at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and nearby coal research in Mulheim. 224 this technique first gasified coal at lower pressures, while 87 then converted the resulting synthesis gas into liquid another powerful force of 295 diesel engines and motor vehicles. Southeast to both processes were expensive and required where they encountered the fiercest German resistance of the entire day. But they offered Germany something it desperately needed, force to defend independence from foreign oil that could be cut off by naval immediately what the Americans were attempting. In December 1933, were shot down the chemical conglomerate IG-7 air battle signed its first agreement 377 with the Nazi American airmen were committing to expand synthetic fuel production at its massive Luna works 265 generous government 24 Liberator bombers. The partnership between German industry and the Nazi state would transform the Reich's energy landscape. The escort fighters tangled with German interceptors. Berlin ordered the creation of Brabag, 100 new company dedicated specifically to distilling synthetic fuels from lignite, the brown coal abundant in central Germany. 381 the four-year plan announced in 1936 engaged the defending Luftwaffe formation. The Reich was building an entirely new industry 61 enemy aircraft, one that would eventually employ hundreds of thousands of planes caught and consume billions of Reichsmarks in investment. 7 American fighters early 1944. Total losses for the day reached 46 operating across Germany and its occupied territories. A painful price that represented together they produced over 124,000 barrels. But the strategic results justified 12 of these were Bergius hydrogenation plants. The attack on Luna stopped which remained the only domestic source of not a single drop of fuel flowed from the massive 9 were Fischer-Tropsch facilities Speer, producing motor Hitler's fuel Minister for tanks, of Armaments, trucks, war production, and transport vehicles. Grasped the catastrophic significance predictably near their raw material sources. 1 week later, on May 19th, in Central Germany around Merseburg and Leipzig, he met privately with Upper Silesia near the Polish border and delivered a blunt assessment that left no room for optimism. And in occupied Czechoslovakia, the enemy has struck us their geographic concentration near coal deposits made them identifiable if they persist at it this time, the crown jewel will soon no longer have any fuel production worth mentioning. Near the town of Merseburg in central Germany. A grimly Luna was not merely a factory, our one hope is that the other side has an Air Force general complex stretched 3.5 kilometers long, 5 days after that meeting 1.3 kilometers wide. Speer arranged for Hitler to hear directly from petroleum industry by a maze of pipes, understood the electrical conduits of synthetic fuel rail lines. They 35,000 workers labored within its boundaries, telling the Führer that the situation would become completely hopeless from concentration Allied airstrikes continued at their current intensity. The most dangerous Decades later, Luna alone writing his memoirs 620,000 tons of fuel per year. Reflected on that moment roughly 11% of Germany's it was on that day he wrote that the technological war was decided. Explosives everything that followed was most critical product out of aviation already determined. Every drop of fuel that kept strike the synthetic plants came again from Bergius hydrogenation on May 28th and 29th, there was no alternative source. The 8th Air Force Field Marshal 993 bombers, Germany's Air Armaments Chief and Deputy to Hermann striking Luna once more recognized this critical vulnerability facility a full year before the Allies exploited it. German fighters in the summer of 1943 attacks against he delivered a stark warning to his colleagues in the German High Command. Knowing what was at stake, the hydrogenation 392nd bomb group lost 6 aircraft in just 35 minutes with them stands and falls between 75 and 100 German fighters swarmed. His warning could not have been clearer, but the bombers kept coming despite the losses. No significant the German defenses were deployed. The Germans repaired Luna with extraordinary speed and determination. The Allied bombers revealed their desperation. Germany thousands of workers labored around the clock to restore damaged pilots and working in shifts that never stopped. All of this within just 10 days of the May 12th attack. The decision to attack Germany's oil production was not early July. It emerged from one of the most consequential and contentious strategic debates of the entire air war. This represented the last time winter and spring of 1944 output levels. 3 competing visions clashed as Allied intelligence used reconnaissance photographs. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder served as General Dwight Eisenhower's Dennis learned to interpret the visible signs of recovery. He championed what became known as the rising from cooling towers. Tedder wanted to concentrate Allied loading areas French and Belgian railway marshalling yards. They systematically destroying the rail network that would carry German reinforcements to the creating a devastating cycle of destruction and repair that exhausted German resources. Professor the workers themselves captured their published a detailed planning saying that in January 1944, proposing today we have finished rebuilding the rail targets. they said. Tedder remained deeply skeptical about attacking oil facilities. Luna was attacked 22 times the real vulnerability of 1944 and April, where the enemy had presumably taken immense precautions. 20 of those devastating raids came from the Marshal Arthur Harris commanded Royal Air Force Bomber Command. 2 came from Royal Air Force Transportation and oil targeting with Pathfinder marking. Harris preferred continuing his area bombing campaign against German cities, 18,328 that destroying urban industrial centers would break civilian morale and eventually force Germany's industrial target in Germany received such selective targeting of specific industrial systems became the most heavily defended industrial facility in destroying any single target category. The 14th Flak Division protecting the synthetic complex. Harris wanted to burn more than 62,000 personnel dedicated solely to anti-aircraft defense. Lieutenant General Carl operated at least 178 strategic air forces and 105 mm and he had heavy anti-aircraft guns arranged in elaborate patterns around the facility. Some batteries were configured in massive formations called Grossbatterien, with up to 36 guns grouped together and capable of laying a prearranged box of exploding shells into a specific zone of sky, with all guns firing simultaneously in a coordinated barrage. The Germans could put nearly 30,000 rounds per minute into the air over Luna. Smoke generators. He required some 70 reconstructive surgeries over many years. He eventually recovered to become a 4-star general in the post-war West German Air Force and later served as chairman of the NATO Military Committee, the alliance's senior military position. Galland himself flew his final combat mission on April 26, 1945. He led 6 Me-262s against a formation of Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers. Hit first by defensive gunfire from the bombers and then attacked by a diving Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. His jet suffered shattered instruments and damage to both engines. He barely managed to crash land with a painful knee injury. The war's most prominent advocate for jet fighters ended his combat career struggling to escape a crippled aircraft. The Arado AR-234 Blitz, the world's first operational jet bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, suffered the identical fate as the Me-262 fighter. German factories produced 274 of these advanced aircraft. Yet by April 10, 1945, only 38 remained in operational service. Contemporary accounts noted that most of the jets simply sat on airfields across Germany awaiting fuel shipments that never arrived. After conducting attacks against the Remagen Bridge for 10 days in March, bomber operations had virtually ceased within 2 more weeks due to complete fuel exhaustion. Germany achieved record aircraft production during 1944, manufacturing nearly 40,000 aircraft of all types. This extraordinary industrial accomplishment, achieved despite relentless Allied bombing, represented the peak of German wartime manufacturing. Yet this production triumph was rendered completely meaningless by the fuel situation. More than 1,400 Me-262 jets built, rarely more than 100 operational at any time. 274 AR-234s manufactured, 38 in service at war's end. Germany spent the equivalent of 40% of its entire military expenditure on aircraft production between 1942 and 1944. The Reich could neither fuel these aircraft nor provide adequately trained pilots to fly them. For the American bomber crews who flew the oil missions, targets like Merseburg and Luna became synonyms for terror. When briefing officers drew back the curtain to reveal the day's assignment, veteran crews responded with what multiple accounts from different bomb groups describe as a deathly moan or groan. New replacement crews quickly learned to read the faces of experienced men. Oil targets were the most feared assignments of the entire strategic air war. Lieutenant Ted Abbott, AB-17 co-pilot with the 384th Bomb Group, flew his first combat mission on July 29, 1944. He remembered the briefing vividly decades later. After a few words, the briefing officer drew the curtain covering the target map, and immediately there was a deathly moan from all the experienced personnel. Abbott confessed that upon hearing that sound from veterans, he did not think he would live long enough even to get out the door of the briefing room. Missions from bases in England to targets around Merseburg covered more than 500 miles each direction, requiring approximately 8 to 10 hours of total flight time in unpressurized aircraft. Crews flew at extreme altitudes of 24,000 to 27,000 feet, where temperatures outside the aircraft dropped to -50 or -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Wake-up calls came between 2 and 3 in the morning. Breakfast before maximum effort missions was ominously generous, featuring ham, bacon, sausage, and fresh eggs. Veterans understood that such unusual abundance at the mess hall meant a dangerous mission lay ahead. B-17 co-pilot Alan Cook described the flak defenses over Luna on October 7, 1944 in terms that capture the bomber crew's experience. When I described the flak over Luna as a cloud, he wrote, "I do not mean just a wall of smoke rising before us. It was a box filling the length, width, and depth of our entire route from initial point to the bomb's away point. There was no path around it or through gaps in the coverage." Cook's B-17 lost 2 engines to flak damage, but managed to limp across Germany and reach an emergency Royal Air Force advanced airfield in liberated Holland. The aircraft was assessed as a complete structural write-off, fit only for salvage. Tom Landry, who would later achieve fame as the legendary coach of the Dallas Cowboys professional football team, was a 20-year-old B-17 co-pilot during the oil campaign. Decades later, he still recalled the missions over Merseburg with painful clarity. He said he could still picture the angry black cloud of exploding flak shells completely filling the sky directly ahead as they approached their target. He remembered with precision the helpless sinking fear he felt as they followed their squadron leader directly into the heart of that deadly cloud, unable to turn away or take evasive action without abandoning the bomb run. The bloodiest single day of the entire oil campaign was November 2, 1944. The 8th Air Force dispatched 638 B-17 bombers escorted by more than 600 fighters against Luna, which had once again been partially restored to production. An estimated 500 Luftwaffe fighters, including Mi-262 jets, rose to challenge the raid in what became one of the largest air battles of the war. 38 B-17s were shot down and completely destroyed. An additional 481 bombers suffered battle damage, representing more than 70% of the entire attacking force hit by flak or fighters. Approximately 400 American airmen failed to return from the mission. The loss rate exceeded 5.5% of attacking aircraft. That terrible mission produced one of the war's most extraordinary individual acts of courage. Second Lieutenant Robert Famoyer served as navigator aboard a B-17 of the 447th Bomb Group. During the bomb run over Luna, 3 separate flak bursts struck his aircraft and shrapnel severely wounded Famoyer in both his side and back. Bleeding heavily from multiple wounds and in excruciating pain, Famoyer refused morphine injections offered by his crewmates. He knew the painkiller would cloud his thinking, and the damaged bomber desperately needed his navigational skills to reach safety. Propped up on the blood-soaked floor of the aircraft with his charts spread before him, Famoyer navigated the lone, crippled B-17 for 2.5 hours, guiding it around known flak concentrations on the long route home. He agreed to accept sedation only after they finally crossed the English Channel to safety. He died shortly after being carried from the aircraft upon landing. He was 23 years old. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The catastrophic fuel shortage shaped every major ground engagement of the war's final year in ways that determined tactical and strategic outcomes. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's Great Ardennes offensive launched in December 1944, was fundamentally predicated on capturing Allied fuel supplies because the Wehrmacht lacked sufficient fuel of its own to reach its objectives. German planners began the offensive with only enough fuel reserves for approximately 6 days of sustained combat operations. The massive Tiger II heavy tank consumed 2 American gallons of fuel for every single mile it traveled. German logisticians calculated they possessed fuel for only 1/3 to 1/2 the distance to their ultimate objective of capturing the vital port city of Antwerp. Kampfgruppe Paper, the lead armored spearhead of the offensive commanded by SS Standartenführer Joachim Paper, consisted of 4,800 men and approximately 800 vehicles, including the heaviest tanks in the German inventory. Paper knew before crossing the starting line that his force lacked sufficient fuel to reach even the Meuse River. Preparation produced the skilled aviators who dominated European skies during the conquests of Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. By 1943, training had dropped to 136 hours per pilot as fuel constraints began to bite. By mid-1944, new replacement pilots were arriving at frontline squadrons with only 110 to 120 hours of total flight experience. This included just 15 to 20 hours in the actual fighter type they would fly in combat. By late 1944, training had collapsed to as few as 40 to 60 hours total. For comparison, American pilots received approximately 300 to 400 hours of comprehensive training before combat assignment. Royal Air Force pilots received approximately 350 hours. German replacement pilots were being sent into battle against these experienced opponents with a small fraction of their enemy's preparation. The outcome was predictable. Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters and one of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces, observed the tragic results with professional grimness. Most of these pilots were lost during their first 5 flights, he stated flatly. The fuel shortage was not merely grounding aircraft. It was ensuring that even the planes that could still fly were piloted by men barely qualified to take off and land, let alone engage experienced American and British combat veterans in aerial duels. In September 1944, the Luftwaffe's flying training organization received what one historian accurately called its death blow. Elementary schools and specialist training programs across Germany were ordered closed. Experienced instructors were pulled from their training duties and sent to frontline units as replacement pilots themselves. By February 1945, the pilot training system had to all intents and purposes ceased to exist as a functioning organization. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, less than 1 month after the oil campaign began in earnest, the Luftwaffe managed only about 300 sorties against the Allied invasion of Normandy. The Allies flew approximately 14,000 sorties that same day. Among the first Luftwaffe fighters to reach the invasion beaches were 2 Focke-Wulf FW-190 piloted by Oberleutnant Joseph Priller and his wingman, who made a dramatic strafing pass down the length of Sword Beach before escaping inland. Despite scattered attacks by other German units throughout the day, the contrast in air power was overwhelming. Galland later admitted the truth without evasion. From the very first moment of the invasion, he acknowledged the Allies possessed absolute air supremacy. The enemy, our own troops, and the civilian population all asked the same question. Where is the Luftwaffe? The fuel crisis found its most bitter and ironic expression in Germany's revolutionary jet aircraft program. These machines represented the most advanced aviation technology anywhere in the world. Properly deployed in sufficient numbers, they might have swept Allied bomber formations from German skies. Instead, they became monuments to the futility of technological superiority without the resources to exploit it. On May 22, 1943, Adolf Galland had traveled to the Messerschmitt factory at Augsburg to test fly the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. He described the experience afterward in almost mystical terms, recalling that it felt as though angels were pushing. The aircraft was truly revolutionary in its performance. It could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour in level flight, approximately 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter in service. Armed with 4 30mm cannons and later supplemented with 24 unguided rockets, a single Me-262 could devastate an entire formation of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers in a matter of seconds. Galland immediately recognized the jet's decisive potential and advocated passionately for maximum production. He calculated that with just 300 of these revolutionary aircraft, Germany could shoot down a minimum of 200 Allied bombers on any given day that weather permitted operations. This was not fantasy or wishful thinking. The Me-262's overwhelming speed advantage was so great that conventional propeller-driven Allied fighters could barely engage it in combat. German industry responded with remarkable determination to the jet fighter program. By April 1945, more than 1,400 Me-262s had rolled off production lines, many from underground factories immune to bombing. Underground facilities were producing 450 additional fuselages per month by the war's final weeks. Yet, at any given time, rarely were more than 100 to 200 jets actually operational. The maximum daily sortie rate across the entire jet fighter force rarely exceeded 55 aircraft, and even this modest number was achieved only once. The largest jet fighter formation assembled during the entire war launched on April 10, 1945. It consisted of just 55 Me-262s sent against more than 2,000 American bombers and their fighter escorts. Despite the jet's extraordinary performance, 55 aircraft attacking 2,000 represented a pinprick against a tidal wave. The jets sat on runways across Germany, magnificently engineered aircraft waiting for fuel that never arrived. Multiple credible sources, including pilot memoirs, official unit records, and photographic evidence, confirm that Me-262s were routinely towed to runway positions by draft horses, cows, and oxen during the war's final months. These images of the world's most advanced combat aircraft being moved by beasts of burden became among the most symbolic of the entire conflict. A standing order directed that jets be towed rather than taxi under their own power, both to conserve precious fuel and to save engine hours on the unreliable Junkers Jumo engines, which required complete overhaul after only 10 to 25 hours of operation. In February 1945, Galland formed Jagdverband 44 at Brandenburg-Brest Airfield, assembling what became arguably the most elite fighter squadron ever created in aviation history. Its roster read like a roll call of Germany's greatest aces. Heinz Bahr brought over 200 aerial victories to the unit. Gerhard Barkhorn contributed 301 victories, making him the second highest-scoring fighter pilot in all of history. Johannes Steinhoff added 176 victories earned across years of combat. Combined, the pilots of this single small unit had claimed more than 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. The bitter irony of Jagdverband 44 was inescapable. These legendary pilots were available to Galland precisely because their previous units had been permanently grounded by lack of fuel. The fuel crisis that made jet fighters desperately necessary simultaneously made them impossible to operate effectively. The unit's founding authorization specified just 16 operational Me-262 jets and 15 pilots. Even this modest allotment could rarely be maintained. The unit typically flew only a handful of sorties per mission despite possessing the finest pilots and most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. On April 18, 1945, Johannes Steinhoff's Me-262 struck accumulated debris on the runway during takeoff at Munich-Riem airfield. The aircraft veered, caught fire, and exploded in flames with Steinhoff trapped in the cockpit. A fellow pilot who witnessed the accident recalled that, in a matter of seconds, Steinhoff had turned into a human torch. Incredibly, despite burns covering much of his body, he survived. Positioned around the complex created artificial fog banks to obscure the target from bombardiers attempting to aim visually. Elaborate decoy sites were constructed in nearby fields designed to draw bombs away from the actual facilities. Every defensive measure German ingenuity could devise was deployed to protect this vital installation. None of it proved sufficient to save German fuel production. Despite all these extraordinary German defensive efforts, Luna averaged only 9% of its rated production capacity from mid-1944 through the end of the war. The desperate pattern repeated itself at synthetic fuel facilities across Germany's shrinking industrial heartland. Pilots on the Baltic coast received 14 major attacks from both American and British bombers. On the night of January 13 to 14, 1945, 2 18 Royal Air Force Lancaster heavy bombers and 7 Mosquito Pathfinder aircraft reduced the facility to a shambles in a devastating nocturnal raid. A follow-up attack in February involving approximately 1,000 bombers from combined American and British forces virtually obliterated the entire site, leaving twisted wreckage where Germany's second-largest synthetic fuel complex had stood. Blechhammer in Upper Silesia endured repeated attacks from the 15th Air Force flying long missions from bases around Foggia in southern Italy. The 15th dropped 7,082 tons of bombs on Blechhammer's 2 adjacent plants over the course of the campaign. More than a dozen slave labor camps dotted the industrial area, holding up to 50,000 prisoners in total. The largest of these camps operated as a satellite of Auschwitz, providing workers for the endless repair efforts. Production dropped to barely 20% of June 1944 levels by February 1945. The production statistics tell the story of Germany's industrial collapse with brutal mathematical clarity. In April 1944, German synthetic plants produced 175,000 metric tons of aviation gasoline. This was the peak, the high water mark of German fuel production before the storm descended. By July, production had collapsed to just 30,000 tons, barely 17% of peak output. In September 1944, aviation gasoline production dropped to just 5,000 tons. This represented a catastrophic 3% of what German industry had produced only 5 months earlier. By February 1945, Production had dwindled to approximately 1,000 tons. Within weeks, it would reach zero. The loss of Romania compounded the catastrophe beyond any German ability to compensate. The oil fields centered around Ploesti had provided Germany with roughly 25% of its total petroleum supply, approximately 7 million barrels in the first half of 1944 alone. Beginning in April 1944, the 15th Air Force launched a systematic campaign against these vital fields, flying 24 major missions through August. More than 5,600 bomber sorties dropped approximately 14,000 tons of bombs on Ploesti and its surrounding refineries in what became one of the most costly campaigns of the air war. On August 23, 1944, Romania overthrew its pro-German government in a sudden coup. Within days, Soviet forces captured the Ploesti oil fields. Romania immediately switched sides and declared war on its former German ally. With this single blow, Germany lost its only significant source of natural petroleum. Combined with the ongoing destruction of the synthetic plants, the Reich's fuel position had become mathematically hopeless. Albert Speer documented the accelerating crisis in a series of 5 increasingly desperate memoranda to Hitler between June 1944 and January 1945. In his June report, he wrote that the enemy had succeeded in increasing aviation gasoline losses up to 90% of total capacity. He noted that only through speedy recovery of damaged plants had it been possible to regain even partly the terrible losses the Reich was sustaining. By December, Speer characterized the fuel shortage as nothing less than catastrophic. In March 1945, he wrote bluntly and without diplomatic softening that the German economy was heading for inevitable collapse within 4 to 8 weeks. The Germans tried everything to save their fuel industry. In June 1944, immediately after recognizing the scale of the threat, Speer appointed one of his most capable subordinates to lead the emergency response. Edmund Geilenberg was a skilled industrial administrator who had previously directed munitions production with notable success. Now he assumed command of up to 350,000 workers, mostly foreign forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners brought to the synthetic plants under armed guard. He requisitioned 7,000 engineers released from military service specifically for repair duties. He personally inspected damaged facilities after every major attack, assessing destruction and directing reconstruction priorities. The Geilenberg program implemented rapid repair teams that could restore partial production within days of even heavy attacks. Engineers built hydrogenation fortresses with thick blast walls and reinforced concrete shelters around the most vital machinery. Massive flak concentrations were redeployed from other defensive duties to protect the most critical plants. Minimum gun allocations were ordered in June. Palitz received 200 guns. Hamburg received 200. Brucks received 170. Wesseling received 150. Gelsenkirchen received 140. Luna received 120 initially, later increased substantially. Blechhammer received 100. 7 underground hydrogenation plants were planned, facilities that would be completely immune to conventional bombing. The most ambitious was codenamed Cuckoo, a massive facility that would be carved from the interior of the Hillsberg Mountain. Construction began on several of these projects using concentration camp labor under brutal conditions. None were completed before the war ended. The Geilenberg program achieved partial success in enabling rapid repairs, extending the life of Germany's synthetic fuel industry by months, but it could never overcome the relentless tempo of Allied attacks. Bomber crews had learned to target the plant's vulnerable interconnected systems rather than just individual buildings. Electrical grids, gas mains, water supplies, and cooling systems all proved extremely sensitive to bomb damage. Even explosives that missed individual production buildings still severed the essential connections that kept the entire complex functioning as an integrated system. The oil campaign created a devastating feedback loop that accelerated Germany's defeat with each passing month. As fuel production fell, fewer German fighters could take off to defend the plants against subsequent attacks. With diminished aerial opposition, Allied bombers achieved greater bombing accuracy and successfully destroyed more facilities. This further reduced fuel production, which meant even fewer defending fighters could fly on subsequent raids. Each turn of this vicious cycle tightened the noose around the Reich's neck. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe was operating with only 10% of its minimum required aviation gasoline allocation. Maintenance and testing procedures were drastically curtailed in desperate attempts to conserve fuel for actual combat operations. Training schools, which had always received the lowest priority for fuel allocations, were the first to be starved completely dry. The decline in pilot training hours tells the story of an Air Force bleeding to death from fuel starvation. Before the war, Luftwaffe fighter pilots received approximately 200 to 250 hours of thorough flight training before assignment to operational combat units. This comprehensive, at the first major geographic objective at the Belgian town of Boulingen on December 17, Paper's column seized a small American fuel depot and halted operations while every vehicle refueled from captured stocks. By Christmas Eve at the village of La Glise, Paper was forced to abandon his remaining tanks and armored vehicles. They had run completely dry with no prospect of resupply. Paper and his surviving men retreated eastward on foot through the frozen Ardennes forests. By Christmas Day, German armored units across the entire offensive front were immobilized or running on fumes. On the Eastern Front in early 1945, the fuel shortage produced equally catastrophic results for German forces. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey reported after the war that German armored forces massed near the Vistula River were immobilized for lack of gasoline and subsequently overrun by advancing Soviet forces. Hitler diverted the elite 6th SS Panzer Army more than 500 miles south toward Hungary, rather than employing it against the main Soviet thrust toward Berlin. The destruction of Germany's synthetic oil plants made it absolutely essential to defend the remaining Hungarian oil fields, the Reich's last significant petroleum source. General Karl Spaatz observed accurately that much of the Soviet advance in the war's final months had been due directly to the immobility imposed on German ground forces by Allied attacks on oil production. The oil campaign exacted a terrible human price from the young men who flew the bombing missions. The 8th Air Force alone lost more than 12,200 airmen killed or missing over the Luna complex. Total aircrew casualties across all oil missions numbered in the many thousands, part of the 8th Air Force's overall toll of 26,000 dead during the European Air War. This figure exceeded the total combat deaths suffered by the entire United States Marine Corps across all campaigns in the Pacific Theater. Despite the enormous sacrifice, bombing accuracy over oil targets remained frustratingly poor due to the combination of German defenses and persistent European weather. On average, across all missions, 87% of bombs fell outside the factory perimeter entirely. American daylight precision bombing achieved only 26% accuracy within factory boundaries under ideal clear weather conditions. Under partly instrument conditions with partial cloud cover, accuracy dropped to 12%. Under full instrument conditions using only radar guidance, which applied to approximately 80% of all missions due to persistent cloud cover over central Germany, accuracy fell to just 5%. Royal Air Force night bombing using Pathfinder marking aircraft achieved approximately 16% accuracy within factory boundaries. Yet the campaign ultimately succeeded through sheer persistence and the cumulative weight of repeated attacks. The synthetic fuel plants required all their interconnected systems operating simultaneously to produce any output at all. Electrical grids, gas mains, water supplies, steam systems, and cooling circuits all proved extremely sensitive to bomb damage. Speer himself acknowledged this vulnerability, noting that even near misses destroyed the connections between facilities. Bombs that missed individual production buildings still severed the essential arteries that kept the entire complex functioning as an integrated whole. Each raid, regardless of accuracy, degraded the system further. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded after comprehensive post-war investigation that the oil campaign heavily contributed to the collapse of the Third Reich and that Allied air power had been decisive in the war in Western Europe. The survey documented precisely that from May 1944 onward, German fuel consumption exceeded remaining production capacity. Reserves were systematically drained with no possibility of replenishment until the German war machine ground to its final halt. Across the entire campaign, Allied air forces flew 654 major missions against oil targets. They dropped more than 28,000 tons of bombs on refineries and synthetic fuel plants. The 8th Air Force conducted 233 attacks, dropping 66,000 tons of ordnance. The 15th Air Force flew 221 missions, delivering 48,000 tons. Royal Air Force Bomber Command contributed 93,000 tons across 200 separate raids, more total tonnage than either American Air Force delivered individually. German aviation gasoline production fell from 175,000 tons in April 1944 to effectively zero by March 1945. This represented a collapse of 97% in less than 12 months of sustained attack. Albert Speer acknowledged after the war's end that the oil campaign represented the most effective Allied bombing strategy of the conflict. Adolf Galland named it the most important of the combined factors which brought about the complete collapse of Germany's military resistance. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and second most powerful man in the Nazi hierarchy, described the oil attacks simply and accurately as the utmost in deadliness. The enduring image of Germany's jet fighter program captures the essence of the entire strategic situation. The world's most advanced combat aircraft, capable of 540 miles per hour and armed with cannons and rockets that could destroy heavy bombers in single passes, being towed to their runways by oxen and draft horses. It was a scene that would not have looked out of place in the campaigns of antiquity. Technological revolution rendered impotent by industrial collapse. Germany's defeat was not ultimately a failure of science or engineering. German researchers developed jet aircraft a full generation ahead of their time. German factories driven into underground facilities achieved record production figures even under constant bombardment. German repair crews rebuilt shattered synthetic plants in mere days with remarkable determination. But fuel represented the foundation upon which all modern military power necessarily rested. Without adequate fuel supplies, the most advanced weapons ever devised became expensive monuments to futility. Every tank, every aircraft, every vehicle required fuel to function. Chemistry and physics offered no alternatives. Karl Spaatz understood this fundamental truth before any other senior Allied commander fully grasped its implications. His persistent advocacy for the oil plan, overcoming initial resistance from Tedder, ongoing opposition from Harris, and initial skepticism from Eisenhower himself, represents one of the single most consequential strategic decisions of the entire Second World War. The oil campaign ultimately consumed approximately 11% of total American strategic bombing effort in the European theater. It produced strategic returns far exceeding that proportional investment, arguably shortening the war by many months. The brave young men who flew through the deadly black clouds of anti-aircraft fire over Merseburg and Luna paid an enormous price to validate this strategic insight. They flew repeatedly into the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses ever assembled in military history. They watched friends and fellow crewmen die in burning aircraft falling from formation around them. They returned to these terrible targets again and again despite their justified terror until the synthetic plants finally fell permanently silent. Their sacrifice shortened the war and saved countless lives that would have been lost in additional months of ground combat. It rendered Germany's technological advantages in jet aircraft and advanced weapons completely meaningless. It permanently grounded the most experienced air force in the world. When the last bombs fell on Luna in early April 1945, the plant was reduced to a twisted maze of shattered pipes and demolished equipment. The workers who had rebuilt it so many times finally stood down for the last time. The German military that had conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years could no longer move its tanks or fly its remaining aircraft. The wonder weapons sat useless on their runways, towed into position by animals because there was no fuel remaining even to taxi. The fuel tanks across the Reich stood empty.